with his wife Emily and his parents in North Essex. Alongside a small owned farm, they run a larger contract farming business growing a range of combinable crops across 1,200 hectares in northeast Essex. The home farm is based around arable production, but has also diversified into equestrian and renewables. So Tom will take questions at the end of his speech, so do have them ready. Please send them via the chat function or the questions box on your right-hand panel. So it's over to you, Tom, and thanks again.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and it's a shame we can't all be in the room today. I imagine, talking about the new technologies that can help drive agriculture forward, it would be incredibly exciting. There'd be a great buzz and there'd be great energy, but we're going to have to make the best of the technology that we've got in the strange times that we're living through. What I'm going to do today is just look at some of the challenges initially that are facing the industry, that are facing the country and even the world, and then look at how technology may be the solution to some of those challenges that can really drive forward productivity, helping minimize our environmental impact. To me, the biggest challenge that we're seeing day in, day out in our current working lives is climate change. If I look back at the last 3 or 4 growing seasons that we've had here in the UK, the weather has been more and more extreme, whether that's the beast from the east in 2018, the drought of 2018, or the wet weather, the monsoon that we had through the autumn of 2019, and then the incredibly dry spring and early summer of 2020. We've got the lowest wheat harvest that we've had in the UK for nearly 40 years. That's something that has been driven by obviously a lower wheat area, but it really is the climate, the weather that stopped us getting that crop planted. In agriculture, we're in a unique position that we can be both a solution to climate change or a contributor through methane gases and through the emissions from the industry. But actually being in that unique position of being a source and a sink puts us in a very powerful position, because actually we can make a fundamental difference to climate change, both here in the UK, but also farming across the world. I believe is one of the critical solutions to climate change, and making sure that we really maximize productivity, we maximize resource use efficiency, and we minimize the environmental impact of any of the actions that we're taking in producing food. The NFU have a net zero, an ambition for food production to be net zero by 2040. The government have the commitment to be net zero by 2050, which is written in law. I think that this is something that's really going to shape the future of food production, the future of farming, and I think our relationship as consumers with the food that we eat is going to look very different, because we're going to have an understanding of what the impact is on the climate that we're living in. Water scarcity is another thing that I think is going to have a fundamental impact on the way we're able to farm across the world. I think the UK is actually, when we look at all the climate change models, the temperate climate of the UK is going to be an incredibly reliable place to farm. We may not believe that at the moment, but water is something that we're unlikely to be short of. The difficulty is that we're going to have an abundance in the winter and maybe a shortage in the summer. So here in the UK, one of the things that I think is fundamental to underpinning our food supply, our food resilience, is making sure that we develop a national water framework which enables us to harvest water through the winter, move water from the wetter parts of the country, the northwest and the west, across to the drier parts in the east, and then utilize that water to produce food through the summer months. But I do think here in the UK, we are going to have a climate which is very well suited for producing food. We also have to think about biodiversity recovery. You don't go through a conference without somebody mentioning that the biodiversity across the UK is in decline, across Europe is in decline, across the world is in decline. Now, if you want my take on this, the fact that we have 7.5 billion people living on this planet is the fundamental reason that we're challenging the planet in the way we are. But ultimately, we have to look at biodiversity now. We've got to make sure that as farmers, as an industry, as a country, we create space for nature. We really minimize the impact of farming, of food production on the wider environment. And we make sure that the food production and the environment really do live in symbiosis and go hand in hand, rather than being an either or. And I think that's one of the really, alongside climate change, that for me is one of the critical challenges that we face. But also I think where technology is an incredibly exciting solution that can help target the inputs in a way that we've not been able to before, So minimizing the use of artificial inputs, maximizing their efficiency, and really targeting them at the plant where they're required. And I think that's something that robotics, as we move forward, is really going to be one of the solutions which can make a huge difference to both climate change, but also to biodiversity. We also live in an incredibly volatile world, and both climatically, which I've already covered, economically, and I think that the impacts of COVID are going to be very far-reaching. There's clearly going to be less money available for investment. There's going to be, the government are going to have a huge challenge in balancing the books. And I think that one thing they're going to be incredibly focused on is making sure that food prices don't rise. Now, I think that really is at odds with having a sustainable farming industry. But I think we have to be, we have to be or recognise that the government are going to be under huge pressure with the amount of money that COVID has cost the economy, and that any sign of rising food prices is something that they're going to believe the population can't afford. So I think that that's something which has changed in the last 6 months, in the last 12 months, and the impacts of that are going to mean that we really have to make sure that we're taking charge of our own destiny as much as possible, and really utilising any government investment in a way which really can just be justified to the UK taxpayer and to Treasury. And I think that obviously that's something that with the Innovate UK funding coming into the Agri-EPI centres, it's something that I think all of us have to focus on, how we can maximise the return from that investment, whether it be at a farm level, at an industry level, at an R&D level. We've really got to make sure that we are giving value for money from that investment. But I also think we live in an incredibly volatile world politically. You look at some of the major political countries around the world, you look at the trade war that's been going on between China and the US, and I think that we probably haven't lived in times like this for many generations, where we really do have the political volatility that we're seeing at the moment. And I think that puts a real focus on how do you underwrite food security? What does a resilient food production system look like? And I think that's a question that we need government to be asking, we need government to be answering, and we need to make sure they really focus on what does resilience look like for the UK population, and how do they want to deliver a resilient food supply. Now, some will say you can do that through trade, and there is a strong argument that the trade is one of the solutions. But in the volatile world we're living in, I really worry that if you completely rely on trade, then you open yourself up to more of the political or the global volatility that I've just talked about. So I think having an element of UK self-sufficiency, of a resilient food supply chain, is something which we really shouldn't take for granted, and that we need to drive forward within this country. And then we've got Brexit. And to go this long without talking about Brexit is probably a miracle in the current climate. But the trade deals that are going to be struck as a part of Brexit, I think really are going to be the game changer for what does UK farming and food production look like. I think there's huge opportunities around the world for countries that really value the traceability and provenance of UK production, something that our consumers here in the UK take for granted, but we really do have some of the greatest traceability that's available around the world. We have some of the highest environmental standards, some of the highest animal health and welfare standards. And I think now we have an opportunity for the government to either be a leader and say, this is actually, we want to set the standard for trade around the world that really takes into account animal health and welfare, climate change, the environment, or they can start a race to the bottom. And if they start a race to the bottom, then that for me is incredibly worrying for what the future of farming looks like in the UK, because I think it's going to undermine our competitiveness. It's going to mean that we have a higher cost basis because the regulations here in the UK won't be dropped. But ultimately, if we're going to import food, which is illegal to produce here in the UK, then that is going to be incredibly challenging for the primary production industry to compete with. And I think the trade deals for the future are going to be probably the key determinant in the future direction of travel. I also then look at regulatory alignment. And I think this is really interesting from a technology point of view, from a science point of view. Now, the trade deal with the EU for me is the most important trade deal that we can possibly strike. It's critical for many sectors that we have as close a relationship as possible with the EU. But if we have to commit to regulatory alignment for the future, then actually some of the benefits that we could see from Brexit won't be possible because of that regulatory alignment. And I'm looking here at plant breeding, I'm thinking about gene editing, and really unleashing the power of our scientific community. And actually, we need access to these latest technologies. We keep the population alive with the latest developments in medicine, using technologies and techniques that we're not currently allowed to use to feed the world. And that, to me, seems hypocritical. We need to use these latest technologies to be able to drive forward production, to minimize that environmental impact, to potentially look at health benefits for society. And at the moment, our scientists are working with their hands tied behind their back. And I think that, for me, that's one of the big questions about the new relationship with the EU is are we allowed to use the tools that other parts of the world are using to try and feed the world. And then we've also got the health agenda. I think we have a society which have reconnected with food during the COVID crisis. There were many people who probably hadn't eaten or hadn't cooked they'd eaten, but they hadn't cooked at home for a long while. They relied on eating at cafes and they're out of home. When that out of home market was shut down, they've actually reconnected with food in a way that probably wasn't seen possible before the COVID crisis. I think we need to think about food being the start of health. We have a view that we need to have healthy plants, healthy food, healthy people, and a healthy planet, and that's what we're trying to deliver. So I do think we're heading into an incredibly exciting time. Change is inevitable. I think there's some very exciting technologies which are going to drive that change in a way which wasn't possible 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. I look at robotics, as I've already slightly touched on, but for me, robotics, whether it be in horticulture and replacing some of the labor that's required for picking, I think that's going to be a huge challenge. But for me, that's where robotics really does need to be employed. It could be in broadacre crops where they're targeting weeds with lasers or with very precise treatments of herbicides to target the weed and not the crop. I think that robotics there is going to be very, very exciting. I think it's probably going to see a shift from bigger machines that over the last 15 or 20 years, we've seen machines get bigger and bigger. And I think we may well see machines start to get smaller over this coming decade as robotics really take hold. I've talked about plant breeding. Greater precision is something that can be delivered via the adoption of technology. And I think that's another area that here in our business, I remember we imported a tractor from the United States back in about 2006 when the exchange rate was very favorable. And before we imported it, we put GPS steering on that tractor. And my father said, I don't know why you bothered putting this GPS stuff on it. We don't need it. Within 3 hours of driving that machine, he completely understood how technology was driving a change which he didn't think was possible before. Now, that's just one example, but I think that it's an example which illustrates what technology can do and how it can deliver. I then move on to data. And data is an area where I think if we learn how to use data as an industry, it really will be able to enable and unlock potential. But at the moment, I have so much information on my computer. I call it data, but actually it's unusable because it only becomes data and usable and valuable when I can pull that information together and start making changes to my business that improve my productivity, that improve my performance, that reduce my environmental impact. And I think utilizing data is something that we really need to get to grips with as an industry. And I think it is a technological development, but not in the way that many people think about data. And there was the example that Dave gave at the start about the calf losses on that dairy farm. Now that to me is a way that we use information, we reduce the mortality, we reduce the carbon footprint immediately of that farm, we improve productivity, we reduce, so it's the utilization of data and information and technology which helps drive productivity, reducing our environmental footprint. I'm then going to touch on vertical farming as another part of the solution. Now I'm still confused as to exactly what this is going to offer. And to me, it seems a pretty high cost way of producing food. So I think they're going to have to be very high value crops. They may be crops that are grown for medicine and things like that. But I do think that vertical farming is going to be one of the solutions that will definitely find a niche, but it's how much of the food that it's really going to provide for the future. But to utilize any of this technology, we need to have sustainable businesses. Now, for me, sustainable businesses work on 3 levels: the people, the planet, and the profit. Now, the people is something that I think we're going to need a very, very different skill set to utilize and maximize the use of the technologies that are being developed now to the technologies that were being used 20 years ago. So I think we have to find a way of making sure we can upskill the industry and really develop the talent that we have, attract new entrants to make sure we're able to utilize the technology to maximize the benefits it can deliver. The planet I've talked about a lot, but we have to make sure that in farming, in food production, we are not, we're not producing food to the detriment of the planet. We really need to work in symbiosis with the environment we're producing this food in. Now that's far easier said than done, but actually it's something we really need to focus on. I do believe technology is going to be one of the things that helps deliver that change. But profit for me is incredibly important. As primary production businesses, we aren't going to be able to utilize the technologies being developed unless there is a return on that investment, unless there is a reward for producing the food. And at the moment, I think that we've seen it through the COVID crisis, that it's highlighted that the risk sits with the primary producer, and we really need to try and find a way of getting more equity within the supply chains, so that the risk doesn't all sit on the shoulders of the primary producer, so that our businesses are profitable, are sustainable, and are able to invest in this really exciting technology for the future. I'll now move over for questions.
Hi, Tom. Thank you very much. We have had a few questions come through, so I'm going to start with one that's come through from Florian Richter in the question box. So you've touched briefly on biodiversity and that you see robotics playing a part in helping to improve this. Can you talk a little bit more about this and maybe give some examples of interesting approaches that you've seen?
So I think I'm probably talking hypothetically at the moment rather than in reality, but I think that robotics are going to enable us to target applications of plant protection products, the pesticides, in a way that we haven't been able to. I mean, until very recently, they were being applied across a 24-meter boom. Now we have a 36-meter sprayer with individual nozzle control, so we avoid any overlap. The next technology that will come along will be a sensor on the boom that will set. They're already working in Australia, so they sense exactly where the plants are, particularly for spraying off the stubbles before planting the crop. And they will only they will only spray the weeds that exist in the field. So you're being very precise in the application. But then I move that on again, and I think we'll end up with robots that actually are able to be solar charged. So you'll have a solar charging point in the corner of the field, that the battery, the robot will automatically know when the battery's getting low, and it will return to dock, and it will charge itself up. And then they'll be able to roam the field, and they'll be able to identify what is the crop and then what is the weed. And they'll be able to target the weed either with a plant protection product or with a laser, which is able to kill that weed. And I think those sorts of developments will dramatically cut the amount of pesticides that we're using. And that has got to be to the advantage of of the environment, of the farmer, of the industry, provided that we get the risk and reward and the return on that investment right. My fear is that we end up with all of these robots being owned by multinational companies that are effectively controlling my farm, and all I am is sort of an employee within realms of that multinational company. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how it develops and whether farmers are putting control of that technology. But I do think they can dramatically reduce the environmental impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a key message there, isn't it, is to make sure that farmers are involved in the development of new agri-technologies to make them suitable for those farm environments. We do have another couple of questions. The next is, so we're in a perfect storm of COVID, Brexit, trade deals, depleting natural capital. How can agri-tech companies engage with the UK farming sector to help address these challenges?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. And another piece I've got written down on my piece of paper here, which I didn't get to, was about a fragmented industry. And I talk about that from a farm level. I think about it from a research level. I think we really are incredibly fragmented. We need to work out how we can collaborate much better. And I think the example that's being set with your 24 farmers on the ground that are really helping drive forward the adoption of the technologies that you're developing and trialing is a great way of trying to move the industry forward. But obviously it's on a very niche level at the moment, and it's how we develop that from 24 to 240 to 2,500 and how you get that growth very quickly once the technologies are proven to work. And it's an incredible challenge. I think our levy body has a huge role to play here. So I do think that the AHDB have a critical role to play in helping develop technologies. But then I think it is about how we work collaboratively. And Dave and I both sit on the Agricultural Productivity Task Force, which is trying to make fundamental improvements to UK productivity. And I think that's another way that we can try and look to bring all these threads together. But there is no easy solution. I mean, the buying groups are a great way of accessing groups of farmers that are already working together. But I'm afraid there is no easy solution to that. And very often you'll end up seeing it going through the middle people, sort of the distribution networks, rather than coming directly to a farm level.
Brilliant. So there are more and more questions coming through. We're going to be taking questions for the next 5 minutes until 25 to 10. If we don't get to all of your questions, we will send them on to Tom and kindly ask him to respond to us, and we'll get back to you via email. The next question that's come through is from a Helen Glass. She says, Tom, what are the ways in which you think more equitable sharing of profit across the supply chain can be achieved? And have you any example of success that you can share?
And again, it's a very, very challenging area. I would love to pretend that we have a solution, and I think that it would be very far-fetched. The grocery code adjudicator has made a big difference since Christine Tacon came into that role. It has helped, but it's only for businesses that are sizable, over £1 million in turnover, that are able to be sort of fall within the remit of the grocery code adjudicator. That has made a big difference. My concern is that at the moment, what was highlighted in the dairy sector at the start of COVID was that actually the contracts that were written that existed weren't really worth the paper they were written on. Now that is not fair. It's not right, and that people can abuse those contracts in the way they did, I think is a clear example of actually we need to strengthen the position so that we understand exactly that when we do have a contract, it does stand up to scrutiny. But I look at something like the horticultural sector. That sector has seen a 15% rise in labour costs, mainly down to COVID this season. But those costs haven't been able to be passed on up the supply chain. That's not an equitable supply chain. Now, that's a supply chain which is driven by a focus to deliver one thing and one thing only, and that is cheap food. I think we have to recognise that actually when a shock happens like that, where there is a completely unforeseen circumstance which has driven costs way above predicted levels, the supply chain should function properly and should be able to take some of that increased cost and pass it up the supply chain. So at the moment, it shows me we have a supply chain that's not working. It's easy to say we relocalize the supply chain. Now, there are plenty of people that would love to start looking at market gardening and really reconnecting with local supply chains. Now, I think that will happen, and it does happen. Farm shops being a great example, which have absolutely thrived through COVID. But I think it would be naive to believe that we're going to break down the power of the supermarkets that we have in this country. So we need to work with them, not against them. They are the biggest buyer of UK food, of UK production. So we just need to find a way to work with them. And actually, some of the direct supply chains, whether if I look at the dairy contracts again, the direct dairy supply chains are the ones that have functioned best in a pressurized climate. So it shows it can work, but I think everyone needs to recognise the importance of having a profitable primary production sector, and then you work back from that as to how it can be delivered.
Brilliant, thank you. We have a few more questions. We have time for one more, but like I said, we will get around to answering everybody else's questions afterwards. The next one that came through is from Tom Slatery. So COVID-19 and the stresses that it put in and on producers that were supplying the hospitality sector pushed the industry to trial local food systems, such as direct-to-customer delivery boxes. Do you think that this is something that could be developed further post-COVID?
I think some people's buying habits will have changed permanently, and I think with those buying patterns, their lifestyles have also changed. So a lot of it for me is going to depend on those people who were working in the city who were commuting, who were, had incredibly busy lives and didn't have any time. If we end up, with a completely different working pattern and people have more time in their lives, they prioritize things that they didn't used to prioritize, then I can see those local supply chains enduring. I think there will be some people that the pull of convenience will ultimately win over, and they will move back towards the supply chains where they were previously buying. But I do think that some of these, some of the farm shops, some of the local box deliveries that have either started up or expanded dramatically during COVID, will continue to thrive post COVID, because for many people they'll have connected with a different type of food. It'll be local, it'll be they'll understand the provenance. They may even get to know the person who's producing it, and suddenly the story around food is so much stronger. And I think that story is something that actually helps connect people with the way their food is produced, with actually some of the values which we've probably lost as society. But suddenly they understand, actually this is, it's growing in the ground, or it's been grazing on grass, and all these things that actually we've just taken completely for granted. We've gone through a period of time where for generations nobody has had to think about where their food comes from, whereas back in March, for the first time ever, you didn't know if you were going to go into a supermarket and what you wanted to buy was going to be there. Now, for many people, they haven't experienced that, and the only people that have experienced it was really during wartime and rationing. Now, I think that's a shock which we have to learn lessons from, and we have to make sure that we do develop a food supply system which really does build resilience at its core, but also recognize the value of the producer within that supply chain.
Excellent. Tom, thank you so much for your session and for answering our questions. Like I said, many more came through the questions panel for you, and we hope that you'll be able to respond to those individually later.